Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the October Dance Talk. Our speakers today are Amy Ogan and Jessica Hammer, both assistant professors at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. Thanks a lot, Amy and Jessica, for being here today. In their talk, Jessica and Amy are going to talk about avenues for underrepresented learners in MOOCs, with a particular focus on MOOC-associated Facebook groups. If you are watching this talk live in the Hangout on air, you can use the Q&A function to submit questions during the talk as usual, and we're going to address these questions after the presentation. So now I'm looking forward to the talk and hand over right away to Amy and Jessica.
Great. Thank you so much, Oliver. So as Oliver said, we're going to be talking today about avenues for underrepresented learners in MOOCs with a focus on what we've learned about Facebook. And when we talk about broadening access in MOOCs, we're specifically talking about two groups, which is learners who don't already have college degrees. By some measures, 83% of MOOC learners already have degrees, and also global learners. So the US and other Western countries are vastly overrepresented in participation in MOOCs, and these are obviously groups that can disproportionately benefit from MOOCs, and yet they are disproportionately excluded. So we would like to address this problem using research. One of the things that we are looking at is this concept of pre-existing social ties. Pre-existing social ties mean the relationships you already have with people in your life before you enter a learning environment. And there's research showing that adult online and offline learners benefit from pre-existing social ties. They're more motivated to learn. They're more persistent when they encounter challenges. And they also feel better about their learning. Even if they're stuck, they are more likely to feel like they're making progress. And we know that pre-existing social ties are especially important for first-generation college students and international students, often because we can see the damage done when they lack pre-existing social ties who are engaged with their learning experiences. And we're looking at these populations because there's research on them that we think makes them analogous to the populations that we care about in the context of MOOCs. So for example, first-generation college students don't have social ties who are experienced with the academic system, just like our learners, we believe, who don't have college degrees. And we know that first-generation college students with fewer social ties who have experience with academia, they're less prepared for college. They find it harder to navigate the sort of formal and bureaucratic aspects of the system, and they have a harder social adjustment. International students is a body of literature we looked at because we think it relates to our global learners. And they may have strong social ties, but they can't access them because they're far away from their home. And they often have trouble making local social ties because of language and cultural differences. And we can see impacts on them as well. They've got more stress. They focus more on academics than on the other aspects of college, which we know are important for long-term success. And they have lowered self-efficacy, so they don't actually believe they can succeed when they encounter hard problems. So all of this is sort of a brief review of the literature that told us that pre-existing social ties should be something that we should look at. And we also wanted to acknowledge that there are challenges to people's pre-existing social ties, that social ties come with social responsibilities. If you have a kid, you cannot stop taking care of your kid because you go to college. You may need to earn money to support your extended family. And your social ties may also not share your values about education, and there may be social conflict with the people that you care about most. So study one, sort of where we started, was understanding the role of pre-existing social ties for self-directed learners from these groups that are underrepresented in MOOCs, which is learners without a college degree and global learners from beyond the Western world. So what we did is we went out and talked to people. We did qualitative interviews. We gave them a survey. We talked to learners who don't have the US college degree, low SES, American and global learners. And we wanted to understand the diversity of roles that pre-existing social ties play in their learning experiences. So we recruited from both groups. And one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to look both at learners, self-directed learners who are super engaged in learning, but some of whom are using MOOCs, and some of whom are what we sometimes call near MOOC learners, learners who could be using MOOCs. They're engaged in education. They're generally working on topics where MOOCs exist, but don't, right? And we were curious about why. So I want to tell you about what we found. And just so, you know, for the arc of the talk, one of the things we found was some interesting stuff about Facebook, which we'll be going into in study 2. But the first thing we found is this is actually really hard to even look at because data collection in MOOCs does not account for class and culture. So when we were interviewing our participants, we found that people were saying things like, you have these educational categories, but they don't make sense because of how the education system in my country works. Or here are these racial categories based on the US Census, which is what's used for a lot of MOOC research. None of these are me. So we have recommendations for how we can even start to collect better data on issues of SES and culture within MOOCs. But even within these limitations, fortunately, we were interviewing people, so we were actually able to get the data that we were looking for. So even with these limitations, we were able to come up with some pretty cool stuff. So we observed some differences. We thought we might find differences actually between our global learners and our low SES learners. But when it came to how they related to their social ties, the more powerful differences we observed were actually between learners who used MOOCs and learners who didn't use MOOCs to support their self-directed learning. And I'll remind you that all 24 of our subjects were people who were committed to lifelong self-directed learning. Right? It's not that some of these participants love to learn and others didn't. These are all highly motivated learners for whom MOOCs could have been an option. So we saw these differences were actually between the ones who did MOOCs and the ones who used other forms of learning. And you can see we've got these 4 areas where we found differences. So they had different models of what learning was and how it fit into their lives, where it might fit into their social relationships. There were differences in how they related to their external social ties in the context of learning. When that wasn't enough, they were actually quite different in where they went to look for additional support. And they faced different challenges. When they got stuck, it was for different reasons. We're going to just be talking about 2 of these things today because it's actually quite a lot of data. But before I get deep into the data, I just want to make a couple things clear about the claims we are and mostly are not making. So we're not implying that there are inherent differences between MOOC and non-MOOC learners. In fact, we don't think these are groups that have inherent differences. We think that there are maybe circumstantial factors or relational factors that are influencing the way that they behave. We don't think that these are sort of different groups. We also don't believe that MOOCs cause these differences. We also chose, we're not comparing learners from these underrepresented groups with college-educated US learners, right? We are looking at the things that these underrepresented learners do. College-educated US learners may also do them, but they're clearly not having a negative impact on their enrollment in MOOCs. Therefore, we're not so worried about it. What we do hypothesize is that there are styles of using social ties that are used by underrepresented learners that align well with MOOCs, and there are styles of engaging social ties for underrepresented learners that don't work particularly well with the educational and social assumptions of MOOCs. And even if this is also true for college-educated US learners, is not stopping them. But if it's stopping underrepresented learners, then we need to be addressing this diversity of engaging social ties to support learning. So the 2 things that we're going to talk about today are these middle 2 concepts. So how our learners, these self-directed learners from underrepresented groups in MOOCs, deploy their existing social ties. So first, I want to talk about this idea of assistants and cheerleaders. So MOOC learners, the sort of phrase we use is assistants because their social ties often help them with course content. And one of the things that we observed is that people in this group had social ties who had experience with formal education or had social ties with specialized knowledge, even if they come from groups where you would expect that they might have no ties in these areas. And when they engaged with these social ties, it was around these areas of expertise. So around how to navigate academia or about how to do things within the course. So just want to give you a couple of examples of the kinds of things that we saw in the data. This is a woman, a US MOOC learner, no college degree, and she's married to a civil engineer. And she took a course in product design and found areas of overlap where her husband's expertise in civil engineering was something that she could deploy to succeed in the course, right? I'm not good at constructing something, so I'll call my husband and I'll get his help, not to talk about my feelings about the course or to give me advice about what I should do, but to actually help me work on course assignments. So some of the patterns that we saw include asking friends or family for help completing with assignments, like Rita did. We saw people creating co-located MOOC study groups out of their existing connections who were interested in or expert in the same content. One of our interviewees was actually from a company that coordinated a group of employees to take MOOCs together. And finally, one interesting thing that we saw in this group was that MOOC learners who were parents were very interested in demonstrating this commitment to learning in front of their children. So their children weren't really in a position to assist them, but they saw MOOCs as an opportunity to show the value of formal learning in the context of that relationship. We're not going to go deep into that data today, but I wanted to bring it up because it's actually a really interesting finding. So our non-MOOC learners had a very different relationship with the people in their lives who they talked to about their learning. And we call it cheerleaders because they got emotional and motivational support. This was often because they didn't have any other option. Their social ties could tell them they were great, but didn't actually have any relevant expertise. But learners in this group, when they did have access to social ties, close social ties, who were available and expert, they were often very reluctant to use them in a way that related to course content rather than to building emotional relationships. So, for example, Larry, US, didn't work with MOOCs, struggling with bipolar disorder, self-taught artist. So he's talking about how he actually trained for an art career, talks about how his ex-sister-in-law, so I assume his ex-wife's sisters, would tell him, you know, you're good at this, you can do it, just keep trying. You know, actually in the face of some quite major challenges, right? I mean, bipolar disorder is not a joke. So the encouragement that he received is one of the things that he cited as factors that helped him continue with his learning. And this is something that we saw very strongly among our non-MOOC learners. But on the other hand, Walt, who is also a non-MOOC learner, learned QuickBooks, talked about what he did to learn QuickBooks. He knew his father was an expert, right? His father was an expert and was available to him. He would regularly speak to his father, but did not ask for his father for help with learning content. And in fact, did not ask anyone in his life for help with course content, rather than emotional support or relational management. But we found that both MOOC and non-MOOC learners often needed additional support. So even MOOC learners who had content area experts at their disposal often didn't feel like that was enough. And as we'll see, non-MOOC learners also sought additional support, but they did this in different ways. So MOOC learners turned to peers, and usually when pre-existing ties were insufficient, but sometimes on top of expertise, successful relationships with very close experts. And from their peers, they talked about getting content support, but also emotional support. And this is one of the things that we're looking more deeply at. They preferred Facebook to the course forums for connecting with peers. So just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that we saw, you know, John from Nigeria, living in Germany, doing MOOCs, would go to the Facebook page for the course, make friends, but as you can see, what they're talking about is also course content, right? My thing is not working. There's this interesting sort of comparative relationship. I finished, you didn't finish, they challenged me, and he talks about that relationship as motivating him rather than as them helping him get it done. And we also saw learners in the MOOC group be very conscious of peer support as part of a larger social support strategy. So for example, Raja from India, studying in a programming MOOC, living in India, put together a whole team of helpers, right? Family members, co-located students. He founded a university coding club and organized a group of peer learners on Facebook, all while also working toward a degree. So learners are, MOOC learners are both willing and able to seek out peer support and to make use of it for both motivational and content reasons. Our non-MOOC learners are not interested in peers. They were really interested in experts. And especially free experts, which their social ties would often point them to. But we also found that they were less willing to ask for help even when it was available. So we don't see Rajas in this group who are assembling teams, layered experts, but rather even when there are low-hanging fruit resources, if it's not a free expert, they're not interested. So Mike's story is one example of seeking experts over peers. He's actually one of the people in our non-MOOC group who wanted to establish a study group with pre-existing social ties, but he wasn't able to, in part because the other people involved were not interested in working with peers. So he went out to get some free math tutoring. That was the area where he needed support. But there were other options for getting support at the same organization. There were group classes. There were other students where he could seek help. And, he reported being completely uninterested in taking advantage of these resources because they lack the expertise of the tutor. So what we see in this data is that some low SES and global students are using their social ties in ways that MOOCs implicitly expect, right? You go out and you get help with content from people in your life, and they may understand how to navigate academia. So they might understand this idea of like, what are the social expectations around assignments or courses? What can this course do for me? How can it fit into my life? And also seek extra help in the ways that MOOCs implicitly expect, right? MOOCs are all about, like, let's connect you with peer learners. This is a style that fits some low SES and global students. But even for these students, there are unexpected results, like talking about how they prefer Facebook to the course forums, right? And that may be a way to work on not just recruiting these students, but retaining these students, if these are the ways that they want to connect with peers when they need help. There is a second common pattern of how these highly motivated low SES and global learners use their social ties, which is about social support, wanting the validation of somebody being an expert if they're going to go to them for extra help. And we would argue MOOCs do not support this social style particularly well. Because these learners are underrepresented in MOOCs, we would argue that one way to increase MOOC's usefulness for low SES and global learners is to address more patterns of the ways that they use social ties. So one of the big picture questions that we're talking about is how MOOCs can better support this second pattern. In both cases, we suspect Facebook is actually secretly really important. But as it turns out, as Amy will tell you, there's very little work on the role of Facebook in MOOCs. So we started by just looking at what's out there and trying to characterize what is happening in the way that MOOC learners use Facebook, and how can we apply this to our bigger questions. I'm going to turn over to her now.
All right, so Jess set us up well for our study 2, which looks at comparing participation in MOOCs and in MOOC forums, and to that learners do in MOOC-associated Facebook groups. All right, so as Jess mentioned, we had many of our MOOC learners, even those low SES and global learners, our underrepresented learners, did talk about their desire to access peers as a source of support for their MOOC learning. However, they at the same time mentioned how scary and overwhelming being exposed to millions of peers, for example, on a course forum could be, and how they may not encounter people that they trusted with their own vulnerability about learning when they would access these forums. So instead, we heard many times that these learners enjoyed the use of Facebook as a supplement to their learning, as a way to access peers and to engage and collaborate with peers. Now, one of the reasons that this may be is that it gives them a face to put on the anonymous peer learner that they might encounter otherwise in a forum or on a MOOC course. And yet, so we do not currently know the extent to which MOOC students from around the world may already integrate their own social media platforms into their learning experience. And so we do know that particularly for global learners, our existing MOOC research will assume that being geographically and culturally diverse in your online peer groups is desirable. We don't actually know the extent to which our MOOC learners actually seek out these diverse experiences, or at times at which they may actually seek out learners who are similar to themselves and with whom they feel more comfortable. And so Facebook actually gives us an opportunity to be able to study the extent to which these two different types of things are happening. Yes, so in this second part of the research, we're digging into our Facebook data and also looking specifically at MOOC data as well. And so in order to do this, we've collaborated with Bob Kraut, who's here in HCII and works on organizational psychology, Michael Massimi, who's at Facebook and is our connection to Facebook groups. And then we have a number of data use agreements from a variety of our MOOC and Facebook sources. So the three questions that we determined were most critical for this very early stage of work were, first, how prevalent are these Facebook groups that are associated with MOOC courses? There has been some prior research that would suggest that Facebook and other social media platforms are actually a successful way for learners to engage in course content. But as of yet, we do not actually know how many learners are doing it, how are they forming these groups, and what is the prevalence of this format of support for these learners. Secondly, we were looking at whether geographic representation in the MOOC Facebook groups was similar or different from geographic representation across MOOC courses. So this might help us understand whether our underrepresented learners have a greater ability to engage in MOOC courses when they are associated with these social media platforms. And then finally, we're asking, to what extent are these MOOC Facebook groups homophilous in language or in location? So this will help us understand whether our learners are gathering in similar or diverse groups and how they're using Facebook as a tool to do so. Of course, there are many other interesting questions we can ask, but given the very early stage of research into these Facebook and other social media groups, this will give us a nice start in terms of focusing future research questions. So, in our data sources for MOOCs, we were drawing from MITx and HarvardX data, looking at individual level de-identified data from fall 2012 to spring 2014. And so these were courses that are available to everyone. Everyone can access this data, and it encompasses 27 courses in total, and the spread of courses is quite wide. So it goes from introductory STEM courses such as Intro Computer Science through several arts and humanities courses. And the data we were able to get from these sources were clickstream data, so things like the number of forum posts or how many people were participating in the forums, as well as surveys that might tell you something about the country of origin. Now, I'll just note here quickly that we also did take a quick look at Coursera and Stanford courses. We got some similar results, but there are particular reasons why they were harder to quantify here. So we do think that you will see similar results if you look at other courses as well. Our second source of data came from Facebook. And so in order to do this, we had to query in the Facebook database, searching for all the variants that we could possibly think of these MOOC course names and numbers. And so in order to do this, we ran these queries, and then we manually confirmed the query results to confirm their validity. And we had to go back and forth and adjust the criteria a little bit. And in fact, sometimes we even requested additional information from group administrators in order to make sure that they were in fact associated with the MOOC course. So from that data, we first omitted all groups that weren't really groups, so anything that had 0 or only 1 member or null members. And then we filtered it to exactly the time span that we had our MOOC course data from so that we could do a direct comparison. And so from Facebook, what we ended up with was group level data. So we could determine the number of members of a group, what the countries of origin of the participants were, their general gender, age, and those sorts of demographic details. Okay, so what did we find? In our first research question, we were looking at how prevalent these Facebook groups were. So how often do you see this phenomena happening? So we give you the data broken down here by MITx and HarvardX, and then the total. And what we see were these 27 courses, and specifically we get to the courses that have associated Facebook groups. And you can see that's about 20 out of the 27 courses, giving us about 74% of the courses in our data set actually have associated Facebook groups. So quite a large percentage. Interestingly, it was not a one-to-one correlation of groups to Facebook courses. Of Facebook groups to MOOC courses. In fact, there were a total of 233 different Facebook groups that were associated with these 27 courses. And these 233 groups spanned a total of almost 30,000 of our participants. Now, this may seem like a small number at first. It's about 6.2% of the MITx participants and 1.3% of the HarvardX participants that were enrolled in courses over this time period. But we have compared this to, the active participation rates in MOOC courses, which are generally only around 10% of the total enrollment. So looking at something like 6.2% of the MIT participants, these are not small numbers. All right, and then we get into the question of how big were each of these groups, and that's actually a more complicated question than you might think at first. The average size was about 127 participants, but the median was only 12, and the standard deviation was 533. So what you can see is that there's a huge right skew in the data. And so we saw even, for example, some groups that had 7,000 members in them. And so if we think about this distribution, we might actually find more appropriate the semi-interquartile range, which shows you sort of the difference between the largest and the smallest group. So that would give us a size of about 28, which we think is fairly appropriate here. All right, so how prevalent are Facebook groups in general? Now we want to go in one step further and think about what it means in comparison to active participation in a MOOC forum. And so if we look at a comparison to people who actually posted on a MOOC forum compared to participants who took additionally an extra step and signed up for a Facebook group and went and joined that Facebook group, we actually see that the Facebook participants in both cases across MIT-X and Harvard-X far exceeded the number of participants who actually did anything active in the forum. Now, I will note here a slight caveat that this is not somebody who posted in the Facebook group, but we think that these numbers might be somewhat comparable in that posting in the forum or going out on your own and joining a Facebook group both require an extra step that demonstrates your engagement with the material. So we think that these numbers are particularly critical for people to pay attention to, both in research as well as you are developing your own course and thinking about where you might have access to the most number of learners. Yeah, okay. So once we know how prevalent they are, we may want to dig in a little bit deeper and think about, well, how did these learners actually get there? What we found was that about 25% of the groups were completely open, so anybody online can just go in and sign up for them. And the other 75% required approval. So whether it was from a teaching assistant or from another student member, you had to actually go in and apply and be accepted into the group, which makes it more likely that you're actually associated with the course content. So within those groups, we were looking at whether they were officially set up by the course director or whether they were a grassroots initiative brought up by the students themselves. And what we found were that the student-led groups far outweighed the official groups. 98% of these groups were created by students and were not listed as official courses. And that's probably where you get that 233 courses for only 233 groups for only 27 courses. In fact, the largest group in MIT-X, which happened to be in an Intro to CS course, was a student-led group that had over 7,000 members. And the other thing that we see is that there are student and instructor-led groups in the same courses. So even if there was an official course, students were setting up their own courses, groups in addition. Yeah, so that may mean that these groups are being set up for very different reasons. Okay, so we'll move into our second research question. How does the geographic representation compare between folks who are signed up for MOOC courses and those who choose to engage in the Facebook groups? What we found were that there were statistically significant differences in the distributions of countries between Facebook groups and the MOOC courses. And this was true for both MIT-X and Harvard-X separately and in aggregate. So if we dive in a little deeper here, we can start to look at a set of the countries for which this may be true. And so for the top 12 countries of participation, we conducted two-tailed z-tests to determine the difference between the independent proportions of participants in the MOOC and participants in the Facebook groups. And what we found were that for all of these countries, the proportions were significantly different, except for those of Greece. All right, and so how do these proportions differ? Well, one of the things that we find is that for the United States and Canada, who are two of the most prevalent groups in MOOC courses in general, there are significantly less participants in the Facebook groups. So as you can see for the United States, almost 37% of MOOC participants are from the United States. However, when you look at the Facebook group distribution, only 20% of the learners who are participating in Facebook groups are from the United States. So these two were both significantly lower. Whereas for our other countries, these countries were all significantly higher than expected participation in the Facebook groups. So for example, India is only about 11% of learners in the MOOCs, but they represent 20% of learners who engage in the Facebook groups. And so this is also true for other countries with smaller participation in MOOCs. So Egypt jumps from 1% of MOOC participation to almost 8% of Facebook participation. Colombia is less than 1% of MOOC participation, but jumps up to almost 4% in the Facebook groups. So we think this is particularly interesting given the sort of global representation of both MOOC learners and Facebook learners. And I think we should also note here that that this doesn't just follow the general pattern of use of Facebook, regardless of MOOCs. So in fact, you know, the U.S. does have actually the highest proportion of the U.S. has the highest proportion of people in general on Facebook, and we do not see that reflected here. All right, and so we move into our final research question. Are the MOOC Facebook groups location and language homophilous? So are learners joining together from the same locations to come and create their own groups? So in order to look at this data, we examined each title and the description manually to determine whether the title was language and or country specific. And then we took a secondary pass at the data and considered groups where learners from a single country made up more than 70% of the membership of the particular location. And so we would consider that to be homophilous. All right, so what we found in general was that over half of the Facebook groups in our data set, so 63% of them, were location or language homophilous, and this covered about 15% of the individual learners. And we found that 30 different countries or regions and 7 different languages were represented in these Facebook groups. So what you see on the slide here are the top 5 of each category. So for example, we see that there were 7 groups that were labeled specifically as for learners from India, and that covered about 571 members. Now, this is true for a location like India that is very language diverse, but we also saw this phenomenon for locations that are more, or have fewer linguistic options, such as Portugal. Next, we see that there's also a large set of language homophilous groups, such as these 19 groups that were specifically dedicated to Spanish language learners. And what we find is that there's actually not a lot of overlap between the location and language homophilous groups. So you might have a location group that works all with learners from Egypt, but the language groups were much more specific, such as Hungarian or Arabic, and then even we had one that included Spanish and Portuguese learners in the title. So what have we found through this data? First of all, we found that the social media use is very prevalent, and in fact may be more prevalent than learners who go on and participate in the forums. We found that learners are actually going out and forming their own independent groups on Facebook and not just joining official course groups. Moving into how Facebook can support our underrepresented learner populations as a whole, we find that the geographic representation in Facebook may actually be more equitable than that of MOOCs. So we're finding more learners from underrepresented countries are joining in on the Facebook groups than perhaps they are in the MOOCs as a whole. And then finally, that our learners may actually be seeking out these opportunities to engage in learning with culturally familiar or language familiar peers. So this may be for a variety of reasons, such as getting support for an English language course, but doing it in your native language. Or it may be for the option to just engage with people who you feel comfortable with, who may be connections in other ways that you may then continue to engage with them on Facebook. And so this leads us to our set of ongoing plans, as these are very interesting findings, but they lead us to many more questions than simply answers. And so we are continuing to dig into the social network services that engage with MOOCs. And so this is, of course, not just Facebook. We're also looking at Google+, and there are other social networking services on which MOOC learners congregate. And so we are able to take a look at the broader scale of how our MOOC learners engage with peers on these types of forums. And so we may do this in 3 phases here. Right now, we've just done a demographic comparison, looking at who's participating in the MOOCs and the MOOC forums versus who's participating in Facebook and social media. In phase 2, we could actually start diving into what are they doing on these forums and what are they doing in the Facebook groups? What types of support are they getting as they engage in the Facebook groups? And does it look similar or different to what they're talking about on the large-scale discussion forums? We may also start being able to dig into the connections that learners are making in these social networking services. So are they connecting with peers that they already have prior connections with, as Jess's data would suggest from the pre-existing ties? Or are they forming new friendships as they engage in these learning activities on Facebook and perhaps friending or private messaging other learners there? And then finally, we'll be able to take this back to our qualitative data and look at surveys and interviews that really tell us how learners feel as they are engaging in these different types of learning supports on social networking services. All right, and so if we look back at our research agenda as a whole, we're working on motivation, engagement, and context for these underrepresented learners, in particularly the low SES and the non-United States learners. And we're working on doing this moving forward in conjunction with several sets of partners who are going to enable us to actually take some of these findings and implement it into potential interventions that might better support the learners based on our findings about their need for engagement with pre-existing ties and their engagement in social networking services. And so we'll be doing this with the Department of State, looking at global learners around the world who are learning English as a second language, as well as lower SES learners here in the United States with the community colleges of California, who may particularly benefit from a deeper engagement with their learners' existing social ties. All right, so I think that's our talk for today, and we're very happy to take questions. Oliver, if you can direct us towards how we answer those.
Sure, thank you very much. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions now that I got from the audience, and also things that I'm interested in, and we can just talk about that in the remaining, what do we have, 10 minutes? Mm-hmm. That sounds good. So well, you can choose if you want to switch on the camera or if you want to stay on the slides, so you can skip 2 slides if you have something that you would like.
Yeah, we'll stay on the slides so that we could show if there's more data that people want to dig into. Yeah.
Sure. So one question is that many people who run MOOCs, instructors who also have a look at Facebook groups around their MOOC, they get the impression that many of these groups are not very active. So have you seen particularly successful or well-functioning groups in your data compared to others? So what is it about those groups that are very, very active and they're very successful in terms of a fruitful discussion in a way compared to others that are not?
Right. Well, I think one problem that the Facebook groups have, even before they get started, is getting the numbers that would be sufficient for these active conversations. So as you could see from our very right-skewed data, there are a large set of Facebook groups that are only 4 for learners. And so those are the ones where you have a problem right off the bat, I think, in just getting the numbers sufficient for an active conversation. And I think, so what we're seeing is that there's maybe a sweet spot between the million people who are on one course in the forum and tiny numbers who are on Facebook. And maybe once you get up to a certain critical mass in Facebook, that's when the conversation really keeps going. And so I think that probably one of the issues that students have is in getting their Facebook group advertised and getting enough people to join it. So having a better ability to connect people to the Facebook groups where they can then go create a critical mass where there's a constant conversation happening, I think that's probably one of the ways that we would recommend engaging them more deeply in the discussion there. So getting them to that source. And then if you get too many participants in your Facebook group, what we're seeing is that they're spawning off and creating other smaller student-led groups. So you could keep the discussion manageable at that with some of those different properties.
So in your opinion, do you think Facebook groups are a space that should remain self-organized? So in a way that everyone who wants to go out of the MOOC platform and discuss outside of the MOOC platform in a space where they are active anyway, like Facebook, are they supposed to self-organize their groups, or would it be beneficial to scaffold this as well, to provide groups, maybe even technology enhanced groups with a way of with some form of scaffolding? So there is work about showing some kind of a social presence in awareness of the learning process of others in Facebook groups. I think Armin Weinberger is doing some of this work. But this requires to provide special learning spaces on Facebook rather than students going off and forming their own groups. So,
right. Yeah, well, so my first thought is that there's a lot of benefit to letting students self-organize. As we saw with the homophily results, you end up getting people who have a very particular interest, who maybe want to discuss the course in a different language, or who want to interact with people for whom they can share local issues and talk about what does, computer science mean for learners in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia. I think that it would be a shame to lose those benefits of allowing those learners to congregate in groups that are meaningful to them. But on the other hand, there's probably is a lot of better support that you could give these learners in these Facebook groups. And I think the technology-enhanced learning environment sounds very exciting for our learners. As we heard from the qualitative components of this work, a lot of them also really wish that they had expert support. And so that is one thing that most of these Facebook groups are not providing, is that additional expert support. And so if you had something that could provide some of that structure or scaffolding or guidance in the groups, that might make them even more successful. And Jess will add.
So I want to add that I think the question is not just how we can make Facebook groups more supportive of these learners, but actually what lessons we can draw from the success of Facebook for global learners, to think about what can we bring back into MOOCs. So if we see learners who are motivated enough that they're going to an external service for which there is no support within MOOCs and making up their own ways of having that service support their learning experience, what that tells me is that they are feeling a major lack, and that for every student who's motivated enough to go out and seek out Facebook groups, there are probably 10 students who are quietly dropping out because their needs aren't being met. So I think that we could think about how to create these Facebook groups For example, make it easier for students who want to go out to Facebook to find Facebook groups associated with the course, or to provide models for identifying experts within the Facebook groups, right? I think those are important lessons, but I also think we should be trying to understand what that drive or that lack is and bring that back into MOOC design. So for what a lot of our subjects talked about was this sense of wanting to know who someone really was before they were willing to engage with them. And I think unsurprisingly, right, low SES students who are in a context full of people with college degrees, global learners in a context that is Western dominated, they feel a sense of vulnerability. They want to know who they're talking to before they decide to be vulnerable in the way that you need to be vulnerable to admit you don't know something and be willing and able to learn. So one thing to think about is also, how can we take the way that Facebook humanizes people and bring that back to MOOCs? And that means looking at what factors of Facebook seem to affect global learners' willingness to engage there, and then saying, so what does that mean? Should MOOCs be using those lessons in their design to make the interactions that MOOCs are offering more meaningful to the learners they're not currently serving well?
One question maybe also is how MOOCs are framed. What is a MOOC supposed to be? So so the C in MOOC stands for course, of course, but this is a particular way of framing that. So you could also regard a MOOC as basically a platform with resources for learning that is somehow self-organized, maybe on Facebook, or it could be seen as a community itself, but something is lacking here in that community because people are leaving that platform. So what would you think is the right framing of a MOOC for the learners that you are addressing, so these low SES learners? So is the MOOC supposed to be a course for them that they're engaged with for a period of time with a certain outcome after a couple of weeks, or is it more beneficial to have it framed as a community, a learning community, or that has no definite end or no definite start, or just a platform with resources for their self-directed learning?
So that's a really good question, and that's actually one of the differences that we found between learners, is one of the topics we chose not to talk about today, but I guess we'll get a chance, between learners in MOOCs and who choose not to use MOOCs, that learners who choose to use MOOCs really do have the framing, not just that MOOCs are a course, but that courses are where you do learning. They saw learning as something that you're doing in the context of an academic environment. It's separate from your daily life. It's not something that's integrated into your everyday activities. So they are perfectly fine with going to a special website where they do learning, where there are assignments, where there are, evaluations, and they find this pretty natural. It's just that's what they think of as a normal learning experience. Our non-MOOC learners had a very different model, and I think it's probably closest to the middle option that you described, which is thinking of a MOOC as a collection of resources for learning. There's a phenomenon that I call magpie mind, where you sort of walk around gathering up all these bits of information and putting them into context in your learning experience. And these self-directed learners were really often very engaged in gathering different kinds of resources and then using it in order to have the learning experience that they wanted. Some of them did take courses, but when they did, they really just saw it as a hoop they had to jump through, a certification that they needed to get. So for example, Mike taking the Steamfitters Union test, right? He was very motivated to get the certification, but we had other learners who were going all over the web, and they really saw learning as a thing that you do wherever you are. And in fact, wherever you are, you always have your eyes open for opportunities to learn. What's really interesting is that this third model that you're talking about, this model of a learning community, is not something we saw among these learners. And I wonder actually if there's a third style out there, right, of people who really see learning as something you do with people. For example, people who join hobby forums, or who really are sort of think of themselves as apprentices, right? I find somebody who's an expert and I work with them. So we may discover other patterns, but that wasn't particularly visible in our data. But I'm going to hand this over to Amy, who has something to add.
I will add specifically about our global population that we saw a few interesting ways in which these learners were utilizing the MOOC course content. One of them was simply to get the certificate because they already knew all of the material in their own language from their own training, and what they needed was to be certified that they had done that they knew the content in English. And so that's a very different opportunity, one in which maybe they do not need this learning community at all. They need, and maybe not even the set of resources, but or some minimal set of resources that would let them get that certificate. But what I think was a more interesting group were our set of global learners who wanted to engage in course material in English as a way of both doing lifelong learning, but also doing it in the context of a language which they felt had many benefits for them. And I think this is a really exciting group because it may be that group that really could build this lifelong community where they're engaging in this learning in an authentic way, but doing it for which they've got a number of personal improvement goals. And there are many learners out there globally who would fit into that context. And so I think that's a really exciting group to work with going forward in thinking about which of these models actually make sense for them. So that's, probably one of our steps in future work as well.
Right. So we're approaching the end of the hour already, but maybe one more question. So another part of the future work that you mentioned was also a content analysis of these discussions. But maybe do you already have an idea what kind of different practices you would see in such a content analysis? And if there is a difference across different kinds of courses. So I can imagine that a course about a very core topic maybe is probably approached differently than something that is more peripheral in a certain field. So a very specialized topic versus a very foundational topic maybe, or something that is I think more in the interest of a very small group compared to something that is important for understanding the field as a whole. So the kind of course, how does it influence the interaction in such a study group? So I see that you haven't done the content analysis yet, but
right.
Looking at the data maybe.
Yeah, so hey, we'd love to work with you on that. That would be very exciting. I think one of the things that we were thinking about as an initial step was to look at the type of social talk that's happening in the social media platforms, because I think that is a big difference from what you might find in the forums, is the ability for the learners to engage in these roles as cheerleaders and motivators and prompters rather than just around the course content. But I think I could imagine that you would also find similar or differences in, as you've described, between types of courses. So, we've got examples from art and history compared to very large groups doing intro to computer science, where I think they're posting more of their problems and solutions as compared to the others. But yeah, I think we're interested in some of the ways that you might see benefits from the social media platforms that you might not see them from the course forum discussions.
All right, so there's a lot to be done and a lot that we can find out in this large amount of data. So thank you, Amy, and thank you, Jessica, for taking the time and giving this very interesting talk. Anyone who is watching this video as a recording, you can still post questions to our Google group, and the group is linked to our website at dance.cs.cmu.edu. And next month in November, we will have the famous Pierre Dillenburg as a guest, and he's going to talk about orchestration graphs on November 5th at 11 o'clock EST. That's it for today. Thanks again to our speakers, and I hope to see many of you next month. Bye.
Thanks, Oliver. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.